Hello, gentle readers. Welcome again to Logos 2000, a study and a survey and research in foundations, mathematical and logical, physical, scientific, statistical, in a sense, yet grounded in the metaphysical, that our theory is really a theory at all, a theory, if you will, a theory as it is here. For formalism and rigor, for our mathematical rigor and logical rigor, of course, because reason and rationality demands rigor to be satisfied, and a formal account of things, as with regards to why thinking beings can help to rationalize in the reason about things overall and how things are and what things are and how they could be. That yesterday or last time was arrived at a great reflection upon Hegel, and ever since my early college reading days, when I began to study philosophy in the course of courses, there was Hobbes and Locke, who I kind of appreciate. And then with Hegel, when I first read Hegel, I thought he was the most profound, and he was my favorite at the time. So it's gratifying that as well that it's just kind of like a giant of the things is Hegel. And this greater logic, or the Wissenschaft der Logik, is it also affects to reflect on a lot of things with the being and nothing for this axiomist natural deduction to make for the dually void and universal. That and perhaps I'd read that before, I was influenced or just found the same thing. It was discovered in the same sort of way. That it's gratifying to be able to point to something like that as a reference in otherwise these sorts of works, and the development of a theory, if not so much a philosophy. Everybody's got their own philosophy, but a theory as with regards to one that there is at all, and that it's real, and yet as well entertains the freedom of what we bind ourselves to, and matters of freedom of thought, and the realm of contemplation and deliberation, as with regards to then our communication and the etymology of our language, what makes for these utterances in the phonemic, I suppose you might say, there could be. So today there's not much going on in Logos 2000, except insofar that there's a bit of what we might aver as of just kind of a gathering of a bunch of different texts, and just kind of looking through them briefly to see if there's established something that can be pulled off of them as something along the lines of a survey, a brief survey of a not very directed sort. So this is Watmo's language. And I picked up this book, and it's a rather non-assuming little book. It's just a little kind of paperback print, and it was printed in the 60s. This says 1959, February 1959. And what it is it's from the 1956 of Joshua Watmo. And what it has is a great amount of study of the linguistics, and it's kind of an artful account of all these different kinds of languages, and the words in the languages and the utterances, and all these different kind of sources and the origins of languages, the palatalization, pitch, length, and stress, clicks, the voice sound, and these kinds of things with regards to the phonemes and phonetics. That he introduces some great terms from linguistics when he talks about things like British American Scientific Industrial Commercial English, Basic, and these kinds of things that in the 50s would have been part of the ongoings in terms of these ways that forms happen, and different ways that people are acculturated to hear sounds and to express sounds and to make these words, like anti-disestablishmentarianisms, the theoretically possible long word compared to supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, an arbitrarily long word, compared to something like, as was read from the other day from the handbook of chemistry and physics, arbitrarily long words, that language prefers. And so this is a great little work, and he mentions many cultural references and many different kinds of ideas, and then common threads and commonalities that arrive throughout these words and stories. One of the oldest words in the world is hurricane, vis-a-vis the Atlantean epoch and all these kinds of things. And he talks about the way that definitions in linguistics occur. They seek to be operational, that is, are given in terms of purely logical symbols. Operational refers to something not entirely demonstrable except in the terms of axioms and postulates already formulated intuitively, but clearly working within the context of the discipline. So here, that's part of this greater account, or the wider theory of this strong mathematical Platonism and stronger logical positivism with regards to these kinds of accounts of the operationalist, the instrumentalist, and these other kinds of comments as being also with regards to the physics in the theory. So Lakmo's work here on linguistics and language is a great read, if for no other matters than that of all sorts of accounts of, for example, the probabilistic interpretation or the analysis of the use of language and usage, when it starts to enter the idea of analyzing it as via means of probabilistic accounts, which, according to the statistics so gathered, would make for the statistical hypotheses, what there may be things, and then neurological accounts helping to relate things vis-a-vis the phonemic or how people pronounce things. Also, what there is going on with in terms of the brain and the nerve response auditory, augmented by the use of a playback technique with certain additions or subtractions. The spectrograms tell us precisely which features of the speech sound or a sequence of speech sounds are important in the perception of that sound or sounds. So these are kinds of interesting things. The limitations on such events are very wide. Word games, ciphers, acrostics, riddles, anagrams, crossword puzzles, magic, squares, disguised prayers, and like common and all known languages all make use of these properties of words. So this is just a pretty great little book, and it helps reflect a great amount of the culture of linguistics in the study. A diagram of the thalamic, hypothalamic, and cortical connections of the human brain after Campion and Elliott Smith. That these sorts of things help to affect to relay that as matters of communications and language, and here quite a study of the brain cortex and the memory and operations and theories of operation, the psychoneurotic condition, it has itself helped to create. That these sorts of things help reflect also on pathologies and abilities. If he should be so gifted of the expression of his own new thought or discovery or invention, and also for society as a whole, to which it gives the medium for making plans of new and long-range developments. These ideas of language. Thus, language is substituted for a direct perceptual context of wider extent, of the whole horizon and of everything within it, of continents and oceans. The vital forces, vocal symbolism, the semantic aspect of speech, whether informative or dynamic, affective or emotive, the capacity for understanding the deepest meaning of words and comprehensively of whole theories. This present discussion is part of it, and all the arguments of politicians and the logicians, the artistry of mathematicians and poets, the brilliant expositions of scientists. True intellection rests upon the richness and instantaneousness of waking consciousness that unites into one controlled linguistic entity, the mechanism of lungs and lips and ears and brain, an active communication between man and man, a record and successful recombination of experience of and intuition into those things that need to be expressed and understood. Language is the vehicle of law, education, philosophy, the sciences, government of all our human affairs and our conduct of them. The great peril is that these or any of them degenerate into a rigidly fixed set of mere speech habits. So this, from the neural basis of language, that's one of the more grandiose sorts of statements, but it is as well helps to affect on its import. There is a mathematical theory of the behavior of nerve networks that promises well to account for memory as the result of the effects produced by cerebral activity upon neurons. and waves and the chemical soup and habituated feedback systems. As with regards to the ideas of memory and association in memory, it's really quite an amazing thing, and it's of various means of mechanism, mostly within the skull case and behind the blood-brain barrier, but not all. Not all. Structural features, language, Sanskrit. English to German, a Gothic, a Latin, a Sanskrit. A common source called Indo-European. Mathematical formulae have been worked out. These kinds of things. A single sentence in language, as in music, is perceived not in real time, the few seconds that it occupies, but simultaneously as a unit, just as the referend is not an item of reality, but both it and the symbol are a whole, each interwoven with the other. The very utterance and apprehension of the symbol disturb the nature of the referend. So, references and the idea of the reflection itself, a reference to a reading, reflection, is quite a powerful thing. I was thinking something about the etymology of the word reflection the other day, and then what it spoke to me was a way of looking at it that I never really thought of it that way. Kind of like both sides of the mirror, left and right, maybe. Either side. Is there yet one side? Is it a reflection? That's not very informative, yet it just gives an idea that was part of the reverie, the dream state, as it were, of this waking dream, in a sense, consciousness. To a linguist, grammar, communication. And then I'm just leafing through the rest of this to see that he had coded some particular words with regards to the phonemes and the mathematics and the phonematics and some of these other ideas that establish that in the science of language there, and for grammar, that there's words as strong or as founded upon the same roots as mathematics, or for mathematical cules, as it were, with regards to atomicules and molecules and atomions and molions. This was what I was reading, something from the electron physics. So Vatmo's book here is a very profound and thorough source, and one imagines that it's quite thoroughly famous. Conceptual foundations of business research. Not too much really to take from this, though we have our operations research, and when he's talking about, he's got a symbolic model, the typical model, computer models, well-known business games, words, meaning, and research, definition, and scientific research, meaning of concept, not in its label. The following are several illustrations of labels for concept and accompanying operational definitions. So here, kind of reflecting as well on the operational and the operations research, is making a formalism, making a model of things. It's model theory and making an object-oriented kind of approach to the things. I suggest careful attention to the terminology just employed. The term is operational specification, not operational definition, as is commonly used. The intent of definition is not contained in operations. That is to say that and that's one of the hallmarks of logicist positivism, is like to pick up and put down any particular theory, whereas there's a certain perceived idea that given an ontological commitment to a theory is that it's enduring itself, that there is one at all. So this just helps to reflect, to relate that in terms of a setting where you're actually having to tell something like a computer or some kind of information system exactly what to do about these things. That sometimes it's a matter here, is that the author has put it, Rigby, he says, don't look behind the curtain, is a way of saying that sometimes. A behavioral model deals with the phenomenon itself and its behavior. So this is usually in terms of interactions, actors and interactions, agents and actors. words, meaning, and research, measurement. So this is a cool little book, and it just kind of helps arrive at what gets into what would be part of what we call a hard MBA, or Master's in Business Administration, a usual sort of degree, whereas a soft MBA is more considered part of what are called the soft skills, which I imagine is how to find who to know with regards to what you know and who you know, these types of things. Wayne Klein's Nietzsche and the Promise of Philosophy. Now, when I picked up this book, I did so because among all the different various works there are about all these different various philosophers and all their various philosophies, then I tend to look at them, and if they don't really speak to me as having something that I would eventually agree on, or something that at least affects to reflect more than a one-sided view, I put it back. So when I picked up this book, I found it had something in it that I thought was reasonable to read. Because, for example, these days, I would put Nietzsche back. I would say, well, in Nietzsche, you just kind of, remove the lid, that's quite a can of worms, and there's a lot of people have just hauled that all everywhere, and it's not something that we don't so necessarily need vis-a-vis the concepts like the Übermensch and these kinds of things, which is the idea of the man's attainment to and fulfilling his potentials, vis-a-vis the earlier notion of is bound by destiny and fate. It's kind of like even Sisyphus, whose sole task for the remainder of eternity is to futilely, arduously, strenuously, tortuously roll a rock up to the top of a mountain, only to have it roll right back down. Is that he's still yet an everlasting a monument to a lesson that that his role is not only that the moral of that story, it is. So that's something about that. The historical foundations of the question of style. Plato and the determination of philosophy. The rhetoric of truth. And so here, then he gets into a philosopher as a writer, and then about Nietzsche and the theory of language and rhetoric. One book I picked up a while ago is called the Nietzsche Register. And what it is in German, and then what it has is all the different source books and references that ever, it's just a giant bibliography of all these things to do with people who then touched upon the ideas of Nietzsche with regards to what they're trying to express in terms of the existential and the madman and his anti-Platonism and these kinds of things. So the author here, so Klein is a couple different things. Like in German, it means small, but in Greek, it means great or something like that. It's interesting the way that the different languages for the same word have different words. That here, Nietzsche's theory of language and rhetoric has what is truth again, and shining truth. So let's see if we can find it about, and Nietzsche's Kara. Language and rhetoric and the birth of tragedy, reading Apollo and Dionysus, symbol and allegory. So the symbol and the appearance and the Bildung and Abeldung and this kinds of things, the idea of appearances vis-a-vis perceptions, and that those become part of actors and agents' ideas about how to affect to relay communications or messages, have here that these are various things. And then he gets into Nietzsche's naturalism, which is basically kind of the bête humaine or the human beast type things. So yeah, mostly Nietzsche's Superman is sort of a beast, and it's usually possible to put it down because Nietzsche was not the most sound of guys. He has some great concepts and insights, and also Sprach Zarathustra is a remarkable and wonderful thing, helping reflect on Zarathustra and the ancient traditions up past like the Zoroastrianism and stuff like that. That also Sprach Zarathustra is great, but then a bunch of the other stuff is perceived as schlock in a sense, and sometimes outrageous. So what I thought to just consider was this idea of what is truth. So on page 74, on truth and lie, paradigmatic in this respect is philosophical discourse, which, at least since Plato, has sought to enforce a separation and exclude figurative language from its parameters. In contrast, much of On Truth and Lie is aimed at showing that this division and separation are untenable, principally because the very structures that produce figurative and literal meaning, for which the trope is paradigmatic, are identical. So here that's the Comenius and Coleridge languages, and they're perfectly well suited to each other and go along just great. If, as Nietzsche suggests, tropes are not just occasionally added to words, but constitute their most proper nature, and there is absolutely no unrhetorical naturalness of language to which one could appeal, then the distinction between literal and figurative discourse is at best pragmatic and provisional. We'll see, it's not as here, so it's not. What is truth? Nietzsche's search for the origins of the drive for truth lead him from the intellect to the word and the concept, and then finally to truth itself, which is described in terms more famous than understood. Partly this is due to the widespread belief that this description amounts to a denial of truth, to the negative assertion there is no such thing as truth, merely lies. The foregoing resume of the opening sections of the essay will make it simpler and make it easier, I believe, to show that Nietzsche does not deny truth in the rather simplistic and polemical manner so often claimed. What is being denied, if one wishes to employ this vocabulary, is the coherence of the correspondence theory of truth, not the concept of truth itself. So that's pretty good, because as a strong Platonist that Nietzsche was, to be able to put down the correspondent and coherent and pragmatic theories of truth as merely empirical and agreed is not so bad. Because according to Descartes' deceiver, he could set the whole thing up. Before proceeding any further, let us cite Nietzsche's now famous description of truth from On Truth and Lie. What is truth? A mobile army of metaphors, metonyms, anthropomorphisms, in short, a sum of human relations which were poetically and rhetorically heightened, transferred, adorned, and which after long use seem solid, canonical, and binding to a people. Truths are illusions which we have forgotten our illusions, metaphors which have been used up and drained of sensory force, coins which have lost their image and are now considered as metal, no longer as coins. So that gets into there's common wisdom and then in the matters of fact, but then for these more transcendent theories of truth and the objective, that it can be quite a thing. So what is Nietzsche's care on the future of our educational institutions? The view of these unpublished writings, Nietzsche later writings, in light of the theory of rhetoric and language he formulated in the early 1870s, Clark's claim that the writings of Nietzsche's last two active years mark a substantial shift in his thinking about truth and represent an unambiguous repudiation of the views outlined in the unpublished writings on language. So yeah, Nietzsche was a bit all over the place. Reason and philosophy. Here we have Heraclitus too did the senses an injustice. And so the whole idea, when he says the senses, then we equate that to the phenomenological, which is those matters of sense perception that can arrive at matters of perceived input or fact. And so Heraclitus had dual monism. And so having a fuller dialectic and mental reasoning is in no way a betrayal of sense perceptions. It's a way to confirm them or reject them. So Heraclitus, as for dual monism, did the senses a great justice. An inevitable falsification. Today, conversely, precisely insofar as the prejudice of reason forces us to posit unity, identity, permanence, substance, cause, thinghood, being, we see ourselves as it were caught in error, compelled into error. So certain are we that this is where the error lies. So Nietzsche at some point arrives at amicus Plato, which is not an unusual thing. So anyways, I thought this book was, it's very interesting. And then it gets into issues of the man. So Nietzsche said, it is clear from the whole nature of an essentially priestly aristocracy why antithetical valuations could become dangerously deepened, sharpened, and internalized. For the priests, everything becomes more dangerous. So on the soil of this essentially dangerous form of human existence, the priestly form, the man first became an interesting animal, that only here did the human soul in a higher sense acquire depth and become malevolent. And these are the two basic respects in which man has hitherto been superior to other beasts. So whether there's original sin or not, or whether man is good or bad by definition, or whether men are friends or enemies by definition, is matters of definition, and it varies. And so I don't really have an opinion about that, except insofar as I find it much easier to have good friends than evil enemies. And as far as the pragmatist theory goes, I just don't keep enemies, and maybe that's just something that's kind of self-serving and just so I feel like I sleep better at night, and that it's less stress. But I do find the alternative to be kind of fallacious at best, and bad overall. Not that it's necessarily untruthful. Logic and illusion. So Nietzsche addresses some of the pathologies of reason unfulfilled. The eternal basic text, which Nietzsche refers to, cannot be understood as something akin to the Kantian thing in itself. For on the basis of the foregoing, one cannot speak of a text in itself. As Kaufmann has observed, for Nietzsche, interpretation is not a commentary on a pre-existing text. What exists before the interpretation is not text but chaos. Hence, there is no eternal basic text, understood metaphysically, to which one could return. Here there is. That's kind of the idea of this Comenius language, is that it has already written out an eternal basic text. And then the other things that are seen as being compelled by that are as well kind of still the same things. They're still the same exercises in the human condition of thinking. Let's see, have here's the escalator method in engineering vibration problems. So this is a thoroughly mathematical work, and so I won't speak too much about here the fundamental frequency vibration of a freely supported rod of variable section. It's like the other day I was trying to study something like, what about rebar in concrete before it sets, and then there are new devices, and you just basically attach a shaker to it, and then affect what it is, the conditioning of the unset concrete as just by shaking the rebar, and then you don't actually kind of need a separate thing for that. But this here is about fundamental frequencies and harmonic theory, as often is called what's related to the Tacoma Narrows Bridge disaster. So this bridge had particular resonant frequencies that almost kind of arrived at from its form and the shape and the wind and its surrounds, that built up kind of like, instead of a rogue wave, which is kind of like random, instead it built kind of like these inevitable harmonic frequencies, and it tore itself down. So the idea in these things to do with bridge building and matters of the rheology and the tribology of problems in engineering and structural engineering make for that. Here's address these overtones, the first and second overtone after the fundamental tones, that make for these reasonings that get into why this escalator method then is a means of making for the things like an engine crankshaft system or bridges that thusly for rigid joined frames, for stresses and strains and forces and couplings and shear and the transverse, things that go into mechanical engineering and ways to solve them. Similarly, this cable structures is about that, but then the cable structures Max Irvine's cable structures is also particularly about the free-falling, free-hanging catenary curve, and why that's a thing. After the parabolic and the theories of like Galileo, it's like, well, it would just be kind of the inverse of inverse square. It's like, well, it's not really. It's like, have you ever computed the line integral for the catenary? It's tough. And so getting into kind of some of the reasonings why for that, it helps remind me that I'd like to reflect on that further for the things like the identity dimension bit and some of these other methods of the integral analysis. As I found some more of those things with regards to reflections about symmetries, and then as well these things. I was reading from an issue from American Mathematical Monthly, like from 1970, and it gets into some of the ideas of how wavelets start to arrive, like as for an article about the ondulets and wavelets that I was reading the other day. But what it's about is about how shock and decay begin and end. And getting into some like solutions, how it's arrived at, because it's not formally linear, these things, yet it ends up making discontinuities to be discontinuities in the things, but there can not formally be such a thing, discontinuity. So it's like this arbitrarily transverse shear, and that has had some discussions in the moment in motion about the wave mechanics and the turbulence theory, under the turbulence theory. But here it says with regards to just the very idea of some of the things that go into making for that these systems of differential equations would have multiple solutions. And so the making then for the overtone and the ideas of resonance theory and overtone is that, yes, they did. Analytic pseudodifferential operators for the Heisenberg group and local solvability by Daryl Geller. Now I've been reading this a little bit, or I was a couple weeks ago, and what it gets into is some ideas of Kohn and Stein, and that make for this pseudo-differential operators, and about the Hilbert space, but then also back in the real space, kind of like Zariski and Kodaira get into that with regards to not the Hilbert space, but back into the real space, and then they just break it back out. That here in these ones, there's these ones that these authors get into about analyticity and the distributions of things, and with regards to the differential operators, and the pseudo differential, particularly a deconstructive account. That some of the key concepts here are the ZEGO projection, that's SZEGO, and with like two accents over it, not like an umlaut, but with two accents. And so that ZEGO projection and makes for a singularity. And then we get into the analyticity and the neighborhoods and these things with regards to those being topological terms. They're about Greiner, Kohn, Stein, and Louis. But then there was, and after Kurzman, Stein, that here the key influences were seen to be Boutet, de Monvel, and Cree, Kree. So Boutet de Monvel, Boutet de Monvel, Monvel, and developed an analytic calculus which is suitable for dealing with elliptic operators on Rn. So Rn is a real number space vis-a-vis the Hilbert space. We need a calculus which is suitable for dealing with analogous operators on Hn, the Hilbert space. The simplest operators that our calculus is intended to deal with, the analogs of the Laplacian, which is the partials, so still yet a partial account and not necessarily going to be suitable for the nonlinear. The analogs of the Laplacian on Rn are the Fulland-Stein operators, L alpha, alpha in the complex. These second-order differential operators on Hilbert space N are intimately connected to the Kohn-Laplacian box B. Fulland and Stein show that if alpha and negative alpha in n plus 2 ... then L alpha theta alpha equals delta, where theta alpha is homogeneous with respect to the parabolic dilations, which are automorphisms of Hilbert n. And it is real analytic, emphasis, or maybe implicitly, it's in parenthetical reference, real analytic away from zero in the Hilbert space. They use this fact to study box B on non-degenerate CR manifolds. They speculated that there ought to be a calculus of pseudo-differential operators modeled on the L alpha and parabolically homogeneous distributions on Hilbert n, just as the usual calculus is modeled on delta and homogeneous distributions on Rn. Such calculus would then be appropriate for the intrinsic non-isotropic Sobolev and Lipschitz spaces on a non-degenerate CR manifold. So what interested me about this book and getting into it a little bit more is that it's got a lot going on in the functional, in the convolutional setting. So things would be related here to the singular. It's much about the analyticity and about to the case where values depend analytically according to the parameters and implicits. That this reflects a body of research and development, and among kind of these mentioned figures so far, that these things would be like so. Whereas the standard pseudo-differential operator calculus is a natural one for dealing with Laplacian-like elliptic operators. They're not Laplacian, but Laplacian-like. The calculus, which we shall describe as the natural one for working with Hermite-like operators. So we have kind of a difference between the Laplacian and the Hermite. So you'll often have heard of the Hermitian and these kinds of things, and that's a pretty great thing to study some more. Thus, the operators R, which this calculus is primarily designed to deal with, will, like the Hermite operator, have the following properties. That S prime of Rn is taken to S prime of Rn. The S of Rn is taken to S of Rn. And if F is element S prime and RF and element S, then F is in S. We shall also produce an analytic version of this calculus. If R is an operator in the analytic calculus, it will have the additional properties. Here it's into the quadratic. Z squared sub 2 of the Rn goes to Z squared sub 2 of the Rn. And if F is S prime and RF and Z2 squared, then F is in Z2 squared. That the Hermite operator has these properties follows from these previous theorems criterion. Part of the point of the calculus is not just to prove that the operators have these properties, but also exhibit parametrices, which are in the calculus. The existence of such parametrices will make properties manifest. So the parametrices help effectively reflect that the implicits make these parameterizations. Our operators will be defined in the Weil calculus. As emphasized by Hormander, who has studied the Weil calculus in great detail, Weil's definition has several advantages and others that it does not. It talks about Schrodinger representation, issues in degrees, uniformity, solutions in polynomials, a Poincaré type lemma. So sometimes when we talk about the Fourier style analysis, that a Poincaré type lemma would be a thing, and I'd hope to know more about it someday. Euclidean convolution. Since we are claiming that lemma 8.4 holds for Hilbert space convolution, although its analog fails for Euclidean convolution. Second, since we lack any effective means to exploit subtle differences between HN and Euclidean convolution by just working on the group side, we shall have to use the Fourier transforms. Maybe a Maclaurin-Clairaut transform. Here's a book. What it is called Global Surgery Formula for the Casson-Walker Invariant by Christine Lescope from Princeton University Press. So when we think of surgery formula, then you'd be reminded of Kodaira and Zariski and how they arrived. It means that after the whole complex analysis is kind of built up with these ideas of analyticity, then it fails. It's like, well, we're going to stitch a patchwork piece about it. But this here is something about itself. It's got dual decompositions, positive and negative crossings in partial P, and that being of the plane, I think. Specifying the dual composition, a symmetric presentation, proof of the symmetry property of the Reidemeister torsion. So torsion is twists, and then how it can be is like, well, how can something twist and then relax. It either contracts and relaxes, or it contracts and pulls back in a sense. So the difference kind of between something spinning and everything spinning around it. As with regards to these things that would get involved with, for example, magmas and fluids and a bunch of different kinds of things. Proving that two well-oriented presentations define the same Reidemeister torsion. So well-oriented, we'd reflect on that as with regards to well-defined, well-formed, well-posed, all these criteria that go into making well-behaved things. This is well-oriented presentations to make it so that then it can equate and equivocate that those being the same kind of Reidemeister torsion, Reidemeister, Reidemeister, or Reidemeister, that's kind of how it is. This is quite thoroughly got a thing going on. Oriented stabilization, a presentation in Hilbert space. This is with regards to a few different parametric settings. Classical arguments of Morse theory. Alexander series, Alexander polynomial. There's much to be said from this, and this reflects a significant body of work and significantly organized schools of work in cohomology, spin structures, and as with regards to then to be relating these to the Zariski and Kodaira, here it says for some integral surgery presentation, where surgery usually means for the surgeon or chirurgeon to cut something, but then it's also almost usually inevitably also means to stitch it back together. Proving, computing, ranks and degrees, a Seifert surface. So Lescope here has got a bunch going on with regards to this idea. The formula for surgeries, starting from rational homology spheres. For any rational homology sphere M, and for any surgery presentation H in M, the surgery formula FMH is satisfied. Lambda x sum mh equals absolute value or determinant or inner product or scalar product in pipes. H1 xmh over H1m equals of lambda m plus fmh. So it affects to reflect that there's, as a kind of L'Hopital's rule, or taken off kind of the front of it, and then it's kind of like a parametric form of a line that results, because it's like y equals mx plus b, and then the y is this differential about that as well. It's like a differential line itself. Relates the one component Surgery formula to the Walker formula, recalled in 4.6. With regards to the Walker invariant. So this is just something to get into to help establish a familiarity with some of the language and with some of the forms, then to arrive at all the most usual sorts of forms like addition formula and vector addition and parametrics to geometry to make it relate to the hypergeometric, so that then it's geometric. Nuclear theory. So this is Sachs' nuclear theory. Now here I wanted to read a little bit from Bernard Despagnats on physics and philosophy, because it's been a kind of an insightful resource to help study it. And it's a lot centered about the aspect type experiments after Allen aspect, and that these after J.S. Bell have helped show that there's a second stage of photonics involved in photinos that make for it so that after the second spectrum of light, that it's super to usual accounts of special relativity and so for physics. And while that's kind of the backdrop of the expertise in the work of Milieu and the operational theory, then Despagnat as well categorizes and catalogs and covers all these different approaches in the philosophies, or a philosophy of physicists, to get to what that means with regards to that distancing itself ever further from realism, and then how to bring that back to make it still an operationalist and instrumentalist idea back to being a realistic thing, and that meaning kind of a true thing, yet as well being that's what, as I started to read it, and it was kind of is waffling or in a hedge in a sense. I wanted to see it reach to something that as well confirmed that theories like quantum mechanics are continuum mechanics and theories like relativity are continuous or continuity. And then what that means for infinity and laws of large numbers and real mathematical infinity is another thing. And what I found then from D'Espagna is he arrives at that kind of well. Before he gets into the appendices, then if I can find this, he had said something about true. And this remains true. Even when the ontologically interpretable Broglie-Bohm model is taken into account, since even within it, measurement results are, in most cases, not identifiable with the true values of the measured quantities. Up to this point, reading back, of course, a realist may consider that everything is still all right. We easily conceive of a universe essentially independent of our own selves, while some parts of it do act on us, and we find it reasonable to only talk about the latter. But on reflection, we nevertheless realize that we are faced with a serious question. If our universal discourse is indeed limited and shaped up by our perceiving aptitudes, are we just, as we just considered must be the case, what guarantees have we that we do perceive facts and things as they really are out there? We saw that the arguments favoring a positive answer, the numerical argument, the one based on intersubjective agreement, are by no means conclusive in this respect. And clearly they look even less so when we remember various elements we came across in the first part of this book. Failure of near-realism, non-separability, weak objectivity of some basic axioms, etc. Certainly, as we saw, it is nowadays impossible to claim with full confidence concerning any physical measurement correctly performed by some well-trained team that it discloses what in itself the investigated object really is quite independently of the human aptitudes at apprehending. And then that's where we'd read up to there. As a result, most of the sages alluded to the above fallback on a position consisting in imparting to the world reality, merely the sense of a sort of synthesis of all of that, in the field of probabilistically predictive phenomena, may be metaphorically represented by means of a descriptive language. In other words, they tacitly rub out any distinction between reality in itself and what I called empirical reality. This way of thinking is worth analyzing. It finally amounts to hoping that it will be possible to keep the essential part of what, philosophically speaking, constitutes the doctrine of physical realism while still implicitly identifying it with a kind of positivism. So here is, that's one of the main goals of the account, and the main, not just desiderata, but a requirement of the theory. More precisely, the idea seems to be to acknowledge the absolute primacy of the notion of possible observation, while simultaneously ignoring the ultimate reference to the fact of getting where the primacy in question normally applies, and to try and make this view consistent. And so there was something I'd read, and I thought I'd marked it, and so that quote is kind of so untrue and profound, but this because this is sort of in the ground of things, in this section of the chapter, the ground of things, and about its development and conclusion, that there is that first that D'Espagna arrives that there's a real realism, and it's for this ground. And he says, for example, I did really refute recently expressed objections to the very notion of a ground. And fourth, last but not least, I consider there are strong positive reasons in favor of keeping the said notion. So it's just kind of to end up that D'Espagna makes the case for realism, and that usual classical instrumentalism and positivism does not have a means to falsify it itself. And being a scientific theory itself, it's undefined. And it can still remain in the theory because the theory may define it. And then that it needs continuum mechanics for quantum mechanics and a continuous space-time for general relativity is an example of how at least many of what are otherwise considered these things, making it tough, that can be mollified and resolved. The real, Platonic ideas, the real, veiled reality, time, Descartes and Galileo's somewhat mechanist, the initial flip, the root probabilistic flaw, or gift, the initial flip. An inquiring mind may also take interest in the above noted fact that the potentiality notion that was central with Aristotle, he opposed power to act and came to be considered obsolete within classical physics with Newton, so it was claimed all his act recovered a status in quantum physics. That at the very basis lay materia prima, which being in no way informed was taken to be pure potentiality. So here it's a sum of theories and a sum of histories and sum of potentials, which makes a potentialistic theory, which is real. And then also that Aristotle has an actual infinity. Besides the usual account of Aristotelianism, that there is not. That there is one that there is. So that's kind of something I was glad to read in kind of a summary of what was derived that in philosophy and physics, of course, after making a very physically minded philosophical account of physics and its philosophy, D'Espagnat is writing in the ground of things, the ideas that would go on to that. And then it ends, and then there's Appendix 1, and getting into the Bell theorem, and otherwise, as mentioned, the quantum mechanical ultra-modern accounts that are advising physics today. So the ground of things ends this. From all of this, it follows that today, even setting into operation an indispensable, acute, critical turn of mind, no more results in discrediting the spiritual impetus that moves mankind. Nuclear theory. Let's take a look at these briefly. Units, dimensions, and dimensionless numbers. Now, this is something I want to look at a little bit more thoroughly, as with regards to the dimensional and dimensionless dimensioned resonator, alternator, and then getting into the walk integral with regards to moment and motion. Because what this helps affect to relay is it's a good study pretty much thoroughly exactly about only the different units and dimensions and dimensionless numbers and their interpretation in the various many fields of physics, physical nature units, the mathematical nature units, conversion units, the units and dimensions of mechanics, heat transfer, electricity, the nature of physical relations, similitude, dimensionless relations, the technique of dimensional analysis. And this is what's considered the dimensionless analysis, or Buckingham Pi, and that there's a wider outlay of that up above. Let's see what he has there in chapter 174, the problems and pitfalls of dimensional analysis. It can be easily recognized that the acquisition of the bare technique of dimensional analysis is no problem. The real problems come before and after the crank is turned. One must first decide what variables enter the problem. So usually you have like a principal component analysis and then something to find what those are. Occasionally dimensional analysis, since it shows the dimension not shared by any of the other variables, unless they're in terms of each other and parameterized. So the dimensional analysis is a setup, it's a prior setup. And so they're into the algebraic derivations, which define everything to do with dimensions and dimensional analysis, the relations among quantities in dimensions, that dimension quantities are quantities, according to algebra, that's all about the algebraic derivations. So that here includes the implicits and all these things that are necessary when variables that represent what become parameters aren't just variables, but they're functionally related to others, so they're not independent. Once the pertinent variables are determined, there's still the question of the proper dimensional picture for them. The dimensions deserve more attention than they usually get. The implications of a dimensional picture are not always obvious. See the implied, the implications, results. 6 constant parameters plus time. Since there are 8 parameters in 4 dimensions, and then he gets into these things. With the angle regarded, it would be related in the same way. Regarded as dimensional, instead enter a relationship such as alpha over LV over KER equals F of T over L over R, comma, JR squared over KEKTL. With regards to things like the charge constants, and it's like, what is that unit there? Is it a natural unit 1? Is like, well, sometimes we make it 1 over 4 pi. So in effect, the initial approach unconsciously demanded a fuller similitude than was desired. So anyways, there's some more to be taken from that with regards to the dimensional analysis, and here the nuclear analysis. Well, here's a little book. It's called Problems of Semantics, a Contribution to the Analysis of the Language of Science by Ladislav Tondel, by D. Rydell Publishing Company, or D. Rydell. Dordrecht, Holland, Boston, USA, London, England, from the Boston Studies in the Philosophy of Science, Volume 66. Translated from the Czech. '66. Enlarged English edition, 1981. So as you might imagine, this is getting also into the philosophy of science and about the language of it. And then we have semantics, and we want to separate syntax and semantics. Then that's kind of the idea, is that some of these accounts are like, well, simplify it and simplify it and simplify it again. It's called a severe abstraction and keeps things real simple. And it's like, well, that's fine, as long as things are real simple. And so then semantics are like, it's kind of like metaphysics. Nobody wants to hear about it because so many people would use it to get into philosophy that's not related. It's like, oh, you mean irrelevant semantics and irrelevant metaphysics? It's like, well, yeah, I don't know anything about it, so yeah, these kinds of things. That semantics, though, are the definition of what things are. Vis-a-vis the syntax is like, and this is our positivist account of it. Take it or leave it, these kinds of things. The editorial preface from Robert S. Cohen and Mark W. Wartofsky reads this way. Ladislav Tondel's insightful investigations into the language of the sciences bear directly upon some decisive points of confrontation in modern philosophy of science and of language itself. In the decades since his Scientific Procedures was published in English, Dr. Tondel has enlarged his original monograph of 1966 on the promise, problems, and achievements of modern semantics. The main topic of his later work has been semantic information theory. A Russian translation, considerably expanded as a second edition, was published in 1975 with an appreciative critical commentary in the form of a conclusion by Professor Avenir Iumov of Odessa. Indeed, many Soviet studies in the problems of the semantics of science show the same sort of philosophical curiosity about the relationship of meanings in scientific language to procedures in scientific epistemology that characterizes Tondel's work, as in the works of Miroslav Popovich, Kiev, and Vadim Sadovsky, Moscow, and their colleagues. But we know that interest in these matters is worldwide, ranging from such classical topics as sense and denotation, empiricist reduction, vagueness and denotational opacity, to the new and equally exciting topics, the semantics of non-unique preference choices, the nuances of informational synonymity, and the semantics of a picture shape, so briefly but beautifully sketched in Tondel's dense and promising last chapter. We are pleased to have had Tondel's kind cooperation in producing this English edition, actually a third edition of his research about semantics. So then the table of contexts reads something to do with like L concepts, logical semantics, problems of logical semantics. So here it's figured that we already have a theory with no logical paradoxes. Then to arrive at that there's a modal and temporal logic to make sure that when we're evaluating different systems and theories and working theories of logic, that it's not just confused which is which. The concept of a formalized language. the concept, interpretation, induction, and the axiomatic introduction of semantic concepts. Frege's conception. So here we talked a little bit about Frege's ideas and thoughts, and if he wasn't quite sure which was which. The method of extension and intention. So that gets a lot into like model theory. Everything's model theory in the sense that the proof theory and model theory are equally interpretable, and that identity, equality, and tautology represent at least three different matters of sameness with regards to likeness and difference, with regards to coming together and on not falling apart or being identically equal or being for all purposes equal. These are ways to look at things as alike. Vagueness and the unsharpness of boundaries. Now that's something that arises when you start looking at set theory vis-a-vis class theory and like Brentano boundaries and these kinds of things, as with regards to things like, well, the real numbers, they're in a row, right? They're ordered, they're trichotomous. It's like, well, if you look really, really closely, you can kind of just see that they're in a fugue. It's kind of like the flight of the bumblebee or something like that. But you don't have to worry about that, because by the time you pull it apart as like a string, then it straightens itself out all the time. And it's just so that in the Planck scale and underneath atomic physics, that mass, length, and time kind of have the whirl there of actually the dimensionless deals. And that's just a super classical concept you're not going to have to worry about, though it is a thing. Praeter necessitatem. That reminds me of something probably like Occam's razor. One of the basic arguments of nominalism was the so-called Occam's razor, which forbade the duplication or multiplication of entities. But the original version of Occam's razor has an extra tag: entia non sunt multiplicanda praeter necessitatem. So don't produce unnecessary entities, and don't produce unnecessary entities unnecessarily. And then there's that Schaffer's lasers: don't produce fundamental entities unnecessarily. But here, though, it's like a deconstructive account means to make for is like something's got to produce the fundamental entities. Occam's beard, in a sense. There's no avoiding the admission that abstract entities are a quite separate sphere, which is A, independent of individuals, B, independent of the subject, observer, or user of the language. This is a view adopted by Platonism and Platonic realism. So, anyways, well, have a great day, gentle readers. I shall so hope that you find that what's about you is that you have a theory of it, and that it's comprehensible, and everything makes sense, even that which doesn't. Good afternoon, then. Logos 2000 today. A brief survey.